Well, again, thanks everybody for joining us this morning. We're going to be talking about rescuing the Sustainable Development Goals here. And I'm joined by Chido Mpemba, Special Envoy on Youth to African Union, and Jayathma Wickramanayake, UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. And we're joining remotely by John McArthur, Director of Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institute. John, are you in Washington?
Yes,
Okay.
for my sins. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Chido, I wanted to see if you could start us off by talking a bit about your role, the Sustainable Development Goals. How are you seeing the efforts in accomplishing the goals that have been laid out?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. First of all, it's such an honor to be here and also joined by my colleague, the UN Secretary General's Youth Envoy. I think when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, I'll be biased being the Youth Envoy for Africa, and I'll base it on that. I think it's important that we incorporate the young people, especially from the context of Africa, because Africa has the youngest demographic as the youth. And young people bring about innovation. And if we need growth, we need to involve them through that innovation. And this goes above board when we speak about, public health, if we speak about economic development and social development itself. We cannot have progress without involving the young people. But when we involve the young people, we also need to ensure that we have an enabling environment to how we're going to involve them. And that would take an intergenerational approach, ensuring that we give them access. This access comes to access to opportunities, access for growth. At times, it can even mean access to financing for them to grow in terms of developing when it comes to sustainability in the SDGs, as well as the Agenda 2063. The Agenda 2063 is also anchored on the Sustainable Development Goals, but focuses on aspirations that are specific to Africa. For example, Aspiration 6, it talks about, potential of the youth, using the potential of the youth and women, that we need that in Africa, whose development shall rely on the potential of its youth and its women. So therefore, having said that, we will be able to achieve them, but only so if we join hands with the youth, intergenerational approach, as well as a multi-sectoral approach. A regional, international cooperation and integration is important too. Yeah.
Jayathma, any thoughts on how to get back on track?
Thank you, Peter. I think the best thing about Chidos and my job is that we get to interact and work with young people around the world on a one-to-one basis that, many of the senior leaders in our organizations or senior leaders in government often don't do or don't care to do. And what I'm hearing from young people around the world is a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustration, a lot of uncertainty about their own future and about their own lives. So a lot of it has to do with our elected leaders or our leaders at the international community continuously making these promises that they never live up to. So when you ask me what needs to be done to achieve the SDGs, I would say first accountability, second accountability, third accountability. We have to live up to the commitments we have made. We have this amazing roadmap, the 2030 agenda ahead of us. So let's invest back in it. Let's make sure, as the Secretary General says, we rescue the SDGs, not only for people who are living in this planet today, but also for the future generations.
Excellent. And John, any initial thoughts on SDGs? How are you seeing these at Brookings?
I think when we look out at the world, we see, the SDGs are often misunderstood. And having worked at the UN, I think they're often described as something the UN came up with, therefore the world should care about. I think they're actually quite the opposite. They're something the world told the UN not to forget about, because each of those 17 goals has a crucial constituency that says, you can't forget about this. We have to stay on the world's checklist. And more importantly, we need a change of pace to get this goal to happen. So right now, we're in a place where we're very much stuck as a world, I would say. I think that's a very pervasive feeling. There are some bright spots of hope and innovations that have come out of the recent crises. We can get into those. But there's a mix of things that either need a big boost or are individually stuck or moving in the wrong direction. And what we really, really need, in my view, is a massive investment strategy, not just for the SDGs, but to help get the world going again. And that's what I think a forum like this can really help people think through.
Thank you, John. Chido, to follow up on that, what are sort of the development trends that can be capitalized on to help everyone get access back up to speed?
Okay, I think if you may just allow me to divert briefly, based on the previous intervention and speaks about investment, that we need to go back to investing. But I think that when we started this off, there were investments that went in. And I think we need to strengthen investment when it comes to the way that we monitor and evaluate the implementation and look at how we can reevaluate that to ensure that we continuously be able to implement in a way that's more sustainable in rescuing them. When it comes to looking at best practices, especially on the development side, I would say that technological innovation is very important. Rapidly developing technologies, have reshaped the lives of communities, of families, and individuals around the world through providing new goods and services. So it's important that we leverage on the access of technology and utilize that for innovation when it comes to this.
Any specifics that come to mind?
Any specific that come to mind when it comes to that is, I think we can look at perhaps the bottom of the pyramid, for example, consumers creating new industries and markets, and changing demand for labor and capital is very important. New technologies have been recognized by the 2030 agenda as well as important means for implementing the SDGs across economies and social and environmental dimensions as well, and as a critical instrument to activities to address existing and emerging challenges as well. So I think that approach would be very, very important.
Yes,
Just
please.
to add to that, Peter, I mean, I'm not sure if these are trends, but I would say observations, things that we found out, particularly during the response to the pandemic. The first one was that we saw very clearly who is being left behind in our communities. We saw that those who are already marginalized are the ones who are getting more marginalized in the response to a pandemic, in the response to a conflict. We saw how we are stalling progress when it comes to the HIV response. We saw that the Human Development Report this year by UNDP showed that we are for the first time showing regress. We are seeing less investments in education and more young people out of school and out of jobs in the world today. And if you look at, people, young women and girls, people living with disabilities, refugees, these challenges are, of course, amplified by more and more scale. So we are now realizing that we are actually not putting those who are left behind first, we are actually leaving them furthest behind. So whatever we learn from these trends, I think the response has to be that we put them ahead of us. And the second trend that I've seen is this weird sort of convolution where we know where a problem is, but we are not finding the solution to that. For an example, education is the most affected sector, or one of the most affected sectors during the pandemic, right? We had 1.6 billion children and young people out of school. We still have close to 300 million children and youth out of school, but 2/3 of developing countries cut their education funding and 1/3 of developed countries cut their education funding. So education is the most affected, but we are cutting funding to education. 1 in 5 young people between 15 to 24 say their mental health is getting worse after the pandemic. Only 2% of our health budgets are being allocated to mental health. So I think there's this mismatch between what is needed, the urgent needs, particularly of the largest generation of people in the world today, and where our investments are going to. So I think we really have to find the right formula of where we invest and how we invest in order to make sure that the investments we are making today are actually smart and they're fit for the future.
Follow up on the technology question. Any technologies that you are excited about? Anything that you're seeing that could help accelerate opportunities?
I definitely think the window of opportunity that the pandemic opened for using technology for remote education and online learning is a massive opportunity. But still, it's not an opportunity, it's a privilege for most people around the world. Still today, 2.2 billion children and young people don't have an internet connection at home, right? But we're talking about that as the reality, which it is not. So I think to talk about technology, we have to first talk about equitable access to technology and connectivity for everyone, but at the same time also digital literacy and digital education, particularly for young women and girls who are being left behind in our communities.
John, any thoughts on that, specifically on the technology question, either specific technologies or just more access to the internet to make some of these technologies a reality?
Yeah, and I'm so glad this has come up. Full disclosure, we recently published a whole book on breakthroughs and how they're in technology and how crucial they are
Great.
to get the SDGs on track. So this is a massive need. And I would say it's not an either or between investment technology, it's an all the above. Because there's so many things where, to get people who need the technology to have access, there needs to be some investment, there needs private, public. But just to answer your question on the technology specifically, I'll give you three that I love. One example is, and we've seen really in the digital space, cash transfers in places like Togo. Through the pandemic, a pioneering minister of digital technology there, they worked with some extraordinary new AI-informed science to get hyper-targeted, hyper-fast, immediate support to the poorest people in the country, hundreds of thousands of people at the beginning, then it's expanded. And this has actually helped change the way the world has understood how quickly we could actually be ending extreme poverty. Other countries like Democratic Republic of Congo have since rolled this out, and others have done it too. So we know that even though this end of extreme poverty has been kind of a lofty, too far away target, in my view, it's now utterly achievable. We could get there extremely quickly, and places like Togo are leading the way. A second, of course, is in the health science. We're seeing massive breakthroughs. Of course, mRNA vaccines are a great breakthrough that no one knew about a few years ago. There are many, many things, especially around community-based healthcare and trust building, where we're seeing to go along with the science and the diagnostics, massive breakthroughs that can help on not just the infectious disease, but also even non-communicable diseases. And then a third, I would say, a big, big one is food science. We are seeing many breakthroughs in agriculture in everything from crop technology to micro-irrigation and the solar systems that could support them in very low-income places. And we're also seeing things like the potential replacement of fertilizer with biology-based technologies. So we have massive breakthroughs that could help bend those curves in addition to the investments that are needed to actually roll them out.
Great. No, that's really, and thank you for those specifics, John. Chido, we've talked about some of the opportunities here. How can businesses be more active in this? I mean, I've written about this a lot. A lot of the major companies in this country love to put the SDG logos all over their sustainability reports. How can businesses be more engaged in the SDG, and where are the opportunities for business to be doing more?
Okay, I think firstly we need to invest in skills and knowledge. It's very important that we do so. Again, taking back to the young people. And that's where business come in terms of, having that capacity to be able to engage young people and invest in them when it comes to the skills and knowledge that are required for the SDGs. Secondly, it's important that we have cooperation, and this cooperation comes with a multi-sectoral approach. It cannot just be the private sector in a silo. The private sector needs to work with the governments, they need to work with the public sector, as well as with the young people. The moment we cooperate together and we integrate this, then we can have better impact. I found that being in this role, it involves working with the governments in Africa, the 55 member states when it comes to youth affairs. But often we have not fully blended that in terms of how we integrate the businesses into that and the young people versus working in silos, because we need this as well for the young people. Again, we need to create that access for the private sector and the businesses to directly invest into young people and young people's businesses. How do we create that platform where we also ensure that when we do so, we build their capabilities and their capacity? Because you find often there is this stigma that comes with being young. First of all, we're often seen as volunteers than professionals, yet there's so much we can bring into businesses. We're professionals as well, So how can we ensure that when we've done that, businesses also see us as professionals that they can invest in, and the ones that can also bring impact to SDGs, not just volunteers that just come and go and help whenever needed to put that logo there. I think it's very important. And if we think that, okay, maybe at this time, again, I'm saying this because, I come from the private sector background. I actually worked in the banking sector for 7 years. And I found that we always look at the risk, like what's the risk that's going to come
Sure.
when it comes to investing
Martin
in young
was
people.
talking about that.
But, when you also need to look at how can we mitigate that risk? Let's look at how we can mitigate that risk. That mitigation can come through training the young people. If we're going to invest in them and want to ensure that there's sustainability in what they're doing, then we need to train them. We need to mentor them. We need to ensure there's intergenerational mentorship and guidance, build their capacity to what we're going to invest in.
Excellent.
If I could add,
Yes, I was going to ask. Yes,
that,
please.
Peter, completely agree with what Chido is saying, and I think so many years after the SDGs, we still see a lot of greenwashing happening, a lot of SDG washing happening, as you said, where companies still to a large extent think that SDGs are a corporate social responsibility project that they're supposed to do, whereas what we're really looking for is a transformation of the business model. And I think the trick here is that it might have worked so far, but the upcoming generation of consumers, particularly the Gen Z, cannot be fooled by that. I think they're very conscious when it comes to what they're consuming, what they're purchasing. And as long as companies do not adhere to those values, to the SDGs, to the Paris Agreement, and to those commitments that we've agreed as an international community, it's going to be very hard for them to sustain their business model this way. So I think this being conscious about this is really important for private sector as well.
That's excellent. Can I follow up? And it kind of leads off of what you just said, but what you spoke about in the beginning that struck me, accountability. What do you mean by that? And can you just elaborate on why you chose to repeat that point?
Yeah, I think a lot of the times, when I convene young people at the UN and they sometimes, walk around the different rooms and the halls in the UN and they ask, okay, what's happening in this room? And I say, it's a meeting about this resolution or this commitment. And they say, okay, so now all the countries will go home and implement it. And I say, well, yeah, some of them will,
Right.
some of them will not.
Right.
And then they ask, so what happens if they don't? And the answer is, of course, nothing really happens if they don't, right? Because many of these commitments are non-binding, they are mutually agreed resolutions, and we have not really set up a accountability mechanism, either it is for the SDGs or the others, for various reasons. But I think that contributes to this huge lack of trust between young people and political institutions, which are actually turning them away from constructively engaging in these issues that affect their lives, whether it's education or climate action or so on and so forth. And this erosion of trust can really result in various ways, can show itself in various ways, even in the extreme conflicts between different groups, right? And the people that they're governing. So my thesis here is that we cannot solve new problems with old solutions or with the same people in the room. And that's where what Chido said earlier, we need to bring innovation into the room, we need to bring creativity into the room, and we need to bring the lived realities of people going through these issues into the room. And that's where I think really there is a massive potential to work with young people around the world, particularly in the continent of Africa, which is really bustling with this population of youth who are willing to contribute with their energy, with their enthusiasm, with their expertise. But we still haven't found ways to utilize that energy that they are offering into making progress in our social and political lives. For an example, if we look at an average age of a world leader today is 62 years old, whereas the average age of a global citizen is about 29, And this gap is biggest in Africa. So how do we make our decision-making rooms more, representative? How do we get more young people into decision-making, into running for political office? How do we get more women into running for political office and getting into these decision-making bodies? Because at the end of the day, whatever we agree, it's our elected political leaders in countries who will make the decisions of which policies to prioritize, where to put the funding in, right? So we have to make sure that our governance systems are inclusive and really respond to the needs of today and of the future.
Great, thank you very much. John, let me see how, are there any, Jayathma was talking about cannot solve problems with old solutions, and you talked about some of the very specific technology benefits, but what sort of the more social problems that we're facing? I mean, yes, the technology is very helpful and presents a lot of opportunity. But what about some of these more ingrained social challenges? How might you be thinking about addressing these problems with new solutions?
Well, this is where I think the SDGs can help if they're used right, and they need to be used right, because I think the whole SDG washing, or what a colleague might call the clip art of SDG, just put a stamp on what you're doing already, is a real risk. And just like in ESG world, you just say something's ESG, but there's nothing materially different, and we're seeing the comeuppance in the markets now on that issue. I think SDGs need to be just as savvy to those issues too. And so what we've seen is on issues, take non-communicable disease, child obesity is a massive issue going in the wrong direction around the world. This is not a single technology problem. This is actually a problem that we don't even know exactly what to do about. Ask any expert in the field. This needs a multi-pronged strategy. You need everything from urban planners to transport people to schools people to health specialists. And what we need is a way for bottom-up learning across communities to say, we found some way to make a dent on this problem. What have you found? And there needs to be real communities of practice where all these experts are brought together to get on the same page, literally and figuratively, around these measured outcomes of how our kids doing in their, BMIs. And so these are real challenges that we have to be thinking through on a practical basis. Mental health, I would put in the same category. It's a massive global epidemic. Violence and urban violence in particular, massive global issue, huge variation around the world. But we have a process, 17 rooms that we've just been convening with the Rockefeller Foundation, bring experts from around the world. And so much of this comes down to how do you boil down so often the lessons that are being brought up in one community so that another community can start to draw from it and make it their own. If we use these sustainable development goals in the right way, the business leaders can be just as much part of that solution as the community leaders and the political leaders. And here I would just add, the notion of accountability of liberal democracies is crucial. Globally right now, we are not in a moment where the liberal democracies are seen as the ones delivering on the SDGs. They're often seen as maybe not following through on their commitments, the high-income countries. We have to be very clear. Even the United States government has not done a self-assessment on how it's doing on the SDGs and has been a little bit moot, even under the Biden administration, on its view on the SDGs. This is a huge consequence for the world that is looking for sources of light to bring people together on what people care about, which is how's my family doing? How's my community doing? And we have to understand this just as much within the domestic economies or within the advanced economies on their domestic issues as within any emerging or lower income economy, because every community is grappling with these issues.
Great. And actually, I wanted to see if I could get you to respond to the question I asked Chido on business opportunities. Where do you see, and you mentioned, I love that phrase, the clip art of SDGs. Where do you see business being more sincere, or the opportunities for them to be more sincere, more concrete, more accountable on following through on SDG opportunities? No, to John, sorry. I asked you that already.
You want to go first?
For me?
For John, yes. No, I've touched on the ladies here for that, but do you have any thoughts on that as well?
I think the business side, there are a few key pieces, and it does have to fuse with the ESG conversation. And the ESG conversation in the global economy comes from risk management, ultimately. That's how it started. But SDGs are about outcomes of how a society is doing. So I think every business needs to be thinking about what's its core product in any part of the world and how that's contributing. But also it needs to think about its own operations and how they're consistent with the SDGs. It's a double-pronged question for every business. So we have some places where in every community in the world, there's a business that's delivering some core product that's helping the community move forward. And we need to understand that and find a way to capture it. This is why things like the consolidation of the metrics and standards, international sustainable accounting efforts are usually important. But also we have to understand a major barrier to this is cost of capital. So many companies, especially in emerging economies, are facing way higher borrowing rates or cost of capital than in the advanced economies. For governments alone, it's about 2%, 2 to 3% borrowing, as the cheapest capital in a society. In the emerging economies, it's typically well above 10%.
Right.
If you're a business and you can't grow, this is a major issue, say, for low carbon technologies, where even where the technology is now cheaper, it's not affordable to get the capital to deploy for a business to get it out to your markets. And we need to be understanding how this cost of capital is impeding businesses in the economies that need it most for themselves and for the world.
Thank you, John. One question from the audience, and please keep sending us the questions. Jayathma, I'll pitch this to you because you brought up the issue of accountability, but I'll get others to weigh in as well. It comes into the government's role. How can governments hold the private sector accountable for issues on climate change, exploitation, low income, sort of abuses? How have you seen examples? Can you talk about how the government can play a role as a regulator in holding the private sector accountable?
I think it's, partly the role of the government to make sure that, not just the government, but private sector as well adheres to these different standards. And I would say the simple answer to that is to come up with effective laws and policies to regulate business environments to make sure that, they adhere to these standards. And the standards have already been developed internationally, right? John was referring to a few of them, but also we have so many different compacts and collectives and guidelines that have been developed for businesses, not only to adhere to climate targets, but also to human rights standards, labor standards that has been developed as well. So, but as I said, there's a huge gap in what's agreed in paper versus what's been implemented. So we really need to bridge that gap. But I also think it shouldn't always be government versus private sector, or civil society versus government, or civil society versus private sector, because at the end of the day we are all operating in the same ecosystem, right? All of our contributions ultimately adapt to the achievement of the targets and the goals. So it's also important to explore partnerships between private and public partnerships. How do we work together to achieve results, even in sectors that are currently struggling, say education, on health? How can governments work together with the private sector to find those innovations, find those solutions, and find the right investments to do so? Another interesting statistic that comes to mind is if the SDGs are properly implemented, we will be creating about 380 million new jobs in our world, right? And these jobs will not be created by the government. Majority of these jobs will be created by the private sector, which is also resulting in the growth of those companies, but also enriching the lives of people in those countries. So I think private sector also need to see this as an investment that they make in the future, but not necessarily as a cost to their current business practices.
Sure. Chido, any thoughts on that, please?
Yes, I think I agree definitely with Jayathma in terms of effective laws and policies. And it's also important that we continuously review the policies, given that we're living in a world that's constantly changing. We've seen what happened with COVID-19. And therefore, it's important that they're very much aligned to what would be happening at that specific time when you put the policies in place. And in addition to this, I'd say governance frameworks and structures are very important. And that will also come back to the accountability. How can we have a proper governance structures in place, be it committees that are made up of the private sector, of the public sector, government institutions, meeting periodically as well to review on this process is very important too.
And Chido, a question for you on, and this gets back to something that John said on how liberal democracies is seen as not following through, some of the challenges that they are having and following through on the SDGs comes into the one dynamic of that is capitalism, the free markets. How can the question was how to achieve SDGs in societies that put capital above everything else? So a lot of these might involve some partnerships or even outright sacrifices. Are there concerns or are there opportunities where to overcome sort of the capitalist mindset to achieve SDGs?
Okay, I think this will also come with a culture approach. We need to be human-centered first before anything else. But that would take us having that mindset and that culture, that it's about the people at the end of the day. And the people are the ones that are affected the most in terms of the implementation of SDGs and how far we've gone with that.
Jayathma, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I do think that the future of business or future of anything that we do is to really put people and the planet at the front and profit at the back. And that's the only way we can achieve the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and basically a healthy, livable planet. So there's no argument, I think, that addressing the root causes of the crises we are facing today is extremely important. And for me, those root causes go back to as old as colonialism, racism, patriarchy, sexism, and even capitalism, extreme capitalism to a certain extent. So.
And I realize I've hugged a lot of the questions on the panels here. So if there's anybody from the audience who has questions for our panelists, please feel free to raise your hand and we will come around with a microphone. As you're thinking of questions, John, any thoughts on that? I know that kind of goes back to, I was referring back to your point. Obviously, liberal democracies are capitalist driven. What are your thoughts on how can the SDGs be really accomplished in a capitalist society? Do we need to overcome sort of the capital intrinsic nature of how that sort of seeks out profits and profits alone, how that can be sort of overcome to make progress on SDGs?
It's such an interesting question. I think it's important to distinguish, even among the so-called high-income countries, the role of the market is different in a social democracy of Scandinavia versus the United States, for example. True. And I think that there's no single way of looking at this. And of course, India's a liberal democracy. Most would still argue there's obviously huge tensions, and it's actually made tremendous progress on many issues in the past several years on poverty-related issues. But we have huge questions around, how do we think through costs and benefits? And it used to be seen as, doing a lot of these investments was a cost, whereas now we're seeing things like, well, if you're in California or if, you're dealing with forest fires out in the west of my home country of Canada and you can't see or breathe, that's actually quite expensive.
Yeah.
And we're seeing in Pakistan, it's extremely expensive right now, this massive catastrophe on both human and economic terms. So I think that the notion of what a cost means is different. And we're also seeing, as much as the S&P 500 might gyrate day to day right now, it's up massively in the long term.
Sure.
But in the United States, life expectancy is not doing so well. And we're seeing the disruptions that that's causing. Again, this year, it's not just COVID. Life expectancy is going down. It's generationally declining. If your bottom line measure of life itself is going down, I think we start to see the consequences in society that this is not working as we're doing it right now. And the notion of recoupling prosperity, which everyone wants to see, that's the definition of fighting poverty, promoting prosperity, with improvements in life and living standards as people assess it themselves, is foundational. So the only thing I would add to that is on the private sector side, we are seeing movements in the investor community different from the corporate community.
Yes.
And this is links in the chain problem, because the companies have investors and they need to make sure the investors are supporting them to do what they need to do and vice versa. And the regulators need to be asking the right questions. And the carbon price, for example, needs to be a good carbon price so everyone has the right incentives. So it all needs to fit. And I would argue we're 5 to 10 years out from this all fitting together better. We're seeing issues like the anti-forced labor legislation coming out of Australia. Affects a lot of extractive industry investors around the world. Canada is about to, I believe, pass similar legislation. UK is considering similar. This is very new because if you're an investor, you still need company-specific data on which to report the risk of forced labor in a supply chain. It's like scope 2 emissions. You're going to need the data to do it.
Yeah.
We have so many of these issues that we still need to develop, not just the regulation, but the tools that allow the companies to align. And I see that as a huge growth opportunity for innovators over the next 5 to 10 years and regulators to say, what's the right way to do this that works for all?
Thank you, John. I believe we have a question.
Hi, my name is Arthur Godiva. I run an innovation studio, and a lot of what we do is make programs around like incubators, accelerators, global competitions, things like that. I like what John said about bright spots, and I was curious around youth and particularly around Africa. Have you seen any bright spots that you can point to that might be good models or examples, or even just purely a bright spot that's something we can look at on how we can engage youth and around social impact, just as a more general term. Thank you.
Okay. I think there's so many examples in terms of accelerator programs that are currently going on in Africa. I'll give an example of Kenya. Kenya is a tech hub, and there's so many of them that, we've had a lot of investments coming into Kenya, investing into young people, as well as their innovations and technology. However, there's been a challenge that comes in that, and that challenge comes with, I'd say maybe financial literacy for the young people, because often what happens is we have people coming in to invest, and then they buy out the companies from the young people, and afterwards young people are left with nothing from these ideas. So what has been coming up the most is actually came out in a meeting that I had with the Kenya government, specifically in terms of, how, my role can come in with that for the youth. And they've said that the challenge is with so many investments coming in, the accelerator programs within Africa, leveraging on this innovation that young people have, but at the end of it, they're left with nothing. And some of them, I remember there's even one example specifically, just recently where I was being told about a specific company, and this was in Egypt, and there were investment that got into that company, but he didn't fully understand the terms that at the end of it, even after the investment of over $1 million, I think he was left with something like $5,000. But he had put a lot of his time in there, a lot of innovation in there, the ideas, and at the end of it, that investment is not coming back in terms of economic development. So that, I think there's room to ensure that when we're doing so, we also have the youth in mind in terms of sustainability and what would be the end game for them. Yeah.
Just to maybe add to that, a common sort of grievance that I hear from a lot of the young entrepreneurs and innovators that we work with is that, it's not like every entrepreneurship venture gets successful, right? Only about 1 in 5 attempts get successful. And when it fails, what sort of security nets do you have? And in a lot of places, young people cannot afford to lose because they put everything they have into these innovations, these entrepreneurship. So I think looking at also social safety nets, social security nets are extremely important if we want to foster a quality group of young entrepreneurs, particularly in low income and lower middle income countries.
That's crucial. I mean, they may have the ideas, they might have the grit, but if they don't have the safety net to catch them if the business fails, which is happens in this country all the time as well, they're not going to take that risk. Any other? Yes, please.
Thank you, Helena Kude, Deputy Permanent Representative of Namibia to the UN. I just wanted to seek your get your thoughts on unemployment. I think that's a challenge that is really pressing for many young people, especially in developing countries, but also in developed countries. I just wanted to hear what your youth-led solutions are for unemployment, and maybe just to in the context of vulnerabilities, if I had to give you an unlimited budget as young people and say, here, fix all the problems of the world, where do you see resources needing to be channeled for young people?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the second question first. I would put that money into strengthening young people's participation in society and in politics mainly. Because as I said, I see as a root cause for a lot of the issues that we are facing today that our decision making is not representative of the people that we are trying to serve. So I would invest that money in creating effective, inclusive, transparent governance systems where young people can have a voice, where they can share power to make decisions about their own future. And I think if we fix that layer, then we can fix, the other issues from education to health to employment to all the else, because they come with the lived realities of living through those issues, like living through unemployment, living through being out of school. So I would say if I have that unlimited budget, I would probably invest in that. But to the first question, unemployment was already a huge challenge before the pandemic. And the pandemic really worsened it. About 1 in 5 young people lost their jobs during the pandemic, and we don't see the recovery happening as fast as the loss. So we are facing a lot of issues both in developed countries and in developing countries. when it comes to getting young people back on the labor market and back on the job market. And I think this is worse in low-income and lower-middle-income countries where about 70% of the young people were in informal employment. So we don't even have records of how many jobs were lost or how many actually lost their livelihoods. One main reason is actually this skills mismatch that we see in the transition from school to work. And this continues to grow as the fourth industrial revolution, progresses, because young people are not getting the skills that they need in order to be employable in the current labor market. And this is, of course, one of the topics that we will explore starting tomorrow in the Transforming Education Summit that the Secretary General will convene, to really look at how do we transform our education system so we equip young people with the right skills that they need in order to be successful in the labor market. So I think while there is lack of jobs, I think young people are also struggling to access the existing jobs because of this skills gap.
That's very true.
Chido, did you have any thoughts on that?
I think I totally agree with the.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is
Oh, can I say one thing on that? Sorry.
Okay, real quick, John, yes.
Sorry, just to chime in. I think we have to understand, you asked about unlimited budget. Our global investments in secondary education are pretty much the most limited budget in the world. $100 trillion global economy, we put about $2 billion a year into what is the biggest skill building mechanism we have. It's almost a zero, and especially for girls and young women, we're missing all of the capacity development opportunities that is so desperately needed to match with that rapidly evolving job market. So we just need to understand this is the biggest mismatch in the world, in my view, investing in our young people's actual skill building and the jobs that they're going to want to get.
Thank you, please. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jessica Mshama from Tanzania, East African Community Youth Ambassador and an entrepreneur. I run a first digital school in Tanzania for nursery and primary school. So my question goes to both of you. What ways should we increase the awareness of the importance of digital skills in schools? And for my experience after starting, I've noticed that there's 3 groups that really need to be empowered, supported to understand very well the importance of digital school. We have the parents that are not aware of how to adapt on the new ways of learning, and they have children in this century that need the digital learning skills, and they're trying to adapt towards it. So we have also the teachers who are not well informed on how to teach these children, how to get the perfect skills of digital learning. So in your ways, what ways do you recommend, as we're going through the General Assembly, to have these 3 groups having to understand and adapt to the digital learning in the modern age that we are in? Thank you.
Do you want to take that?
Okay. I think looking at that, it's very important, again, having an enabling environment. I'm trying to imagine where you're in a situation, we're faced with poverty, lack of food, lack of access to water, and then we also have digital. Where exactly do we then place it in this? And how do we ensure that we start speaking about the benefits that come with that digital literacy? Because at that time, if you look at a parent or even as a youth, your first thought of mind is on, I need to get food on the table for my children. But at the same time, we're now speaking about, I need to make sure that they're up to date with what's happening in technology and digital, innovation. So it's a matter of creating that enabling environment and also looking at the positive factors to say, okay, if we ensure that we have this enabling environment for digital literacy, these are the benefits that can come for the future for my children when it comes to economic development and opportunities for them and thinking towards the future. So it's about how we can create that environment as well, because at the moment, I'm sure they'll also be thinking of now, how do we survive in the now? But we also need to ensure that we think about how do we survive in the future and create that for the children. When it comes to the teachers, it also has to do with how do we enable the teachers? Again, it goes back to that integration and cooperation of the public sector, the private sector, and everyone getting involved. Because for us to enable them, it means we need to build their capacities too. And that can also come into policy when it comes to education system. I'm really glad with the education summit that's coming up and the wonderful work that has been done, through what will be presented to the General Assembly on the Youth Declaration and the process that Jayathma's office has been working on. And I think it's very important that, with that in mind, that accountability, when those recommendations come, how to ensure that it then goes down to national domestication as well as national implementation, and that responsibility that comes to it. An example, again, in one of discussions that we previously had with youth, specifically in Africa and education, was on thinking around advisory councils, even bringing young people on board, that when we're making these recommendations, we have advisory councils and youth groups that are also there to look at the implementation, the monitoring, the evaluation as well, which is very important in that deliverable. Yeah.
I mean, you're probably an expert in this than we are, and I would say just to continue what you're doing, and I think scaling up the model that you are having in Tanzania in other places would be sort of my answer to that, because I think both needs to happen at the same time. One is government and other stakeholders increasing access to technology, because as Chido said, if you're suffering with poverty and food shortages and lack of access to basic services, then digital technologies seem like a luxury, right? So making connectivity accessible to everyone everywhere has to happen, but we cannot wait until we achieve 100% connectivity in order to start implementing digital skills, right? So I think finding out solutions like the one that you described and scaling them up, and I think connecting it to also the earlier question of finding how youth entrepreneurship and innovation can couple with social impact and help deliver the most basic services to people, in this case education, is something that I think governments need to be increasingly looking at.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes, ma'am?
Do I need the mic or?
Oh, no, just I think raise your voice. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jayathma. Thank you, Chido and John. I'm Patricia Chavez from the UN Secretariat. And thank you. I'm Patricia Chavez from the UN Secretariat. And as you all know, the SDG Summit is going to take place next year in 2023. And is the midpoint in reviewing the implementation of the SDGs. So, but how do we recreate enthusiasm from young people in the SDG Summit next year? So how do we get them excited? How do they want to be engaged? And what do they want out of that summit next September in 2023? Thank you.
And thank you for reminding us. I wasn't aware of that, so thank you for.
No, I mean, I do think, though, that many young people are aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, say compared to the Millennium Development Goals, right, which was before. I've seen SDGs being implemented and used as a model in the most rural places of the world, in sort of, in rural schools in Bangladesh. I went to a youth coding camp in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. Yeah. I saw SDGs there. So, it's not like governments or somebody is going and telling them, okay, these are the SDGs, you implement them in your project. No, but they learn about it, they own it, they try to implement it as much as they can in their communities. But what I was saying, I mean, I'm coming back to my first answer, is that is this frustration that they have. We are trying to do what we can in our communities, but we are not seeing the same level of commitment. We are not seeing the same level of investment from world leaders and our elected leaders. And I think it won't make a lot of sense if we get young people excited about the SDGs and still if we don't see results, right? So I think really making sure that we are able to show results, show concrete commitment and concrete investment is the only way that you can build trust of young people in these institutions and in these frameworks. And that's the only way that they can be excited about then what's there for the future, right? So I would go back to sort of my answer on accountability and making sure that we really show concrete results and concrete outcomes. And that, I think, leaders has to show by commitment, because right now what we are seeing is, even if you take the General Assembly that will kickstart next week, many world leaders come to New York and they speak to their national audiences. right? Many are trying to get their speaking slot to get it aligned with their national primetime TV times, because they're here to talk to their national audiences and not to really work in multilateral cooperation and in partnership, which is so direly needed for us to rescue the SDGs and put ourselves back on track. So I would highly call on and highly recommend that in order to get young people excited and interested and trusted in these systems, that our political leaders show good faith and show goodwill and show commitment.
Chido, any final thoughts on that?
I think just, with what Jayathma said, I totally agree with that. The political commitments are very, very important. So it goes beyond being ceremonial as well. But what can we actually deliver? Yeah.
And John, any final thoughts in response to that?
Yeah, I have a slightly different view. I think I'm all for political accountability, but I don't have great hopes right now that in the next 12 months the world's going to fix itself. And I actually think we need to flip the question and say, how do we let the young people of the world take the SDGs into their own hands so that they're the ones empowered to take action against these goals? We have this device, 17 rooms. We have people from Nigeria to South America to Iceland and other parts of the world where they're saying, what can we do in our community for the SDGs? Why don't we have a day the week before, September 17th, before all these world leaders get together to say, here's what we're doing, and create a little pressure to say, hope you do your part too. I don't think the world is wanting to wait on political leaders right now. I think the world wants to see progress and they want to help drive it themselves, young people more than anyone.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll have to leave it there. Chido, Jayathma, and John, thanks so much for your time and for participating today.